Hey everyone, Peter the Tender here, welcome, I would say, welcoming you to my session on leaving the work items management to the agents. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you're going to enjoy this session as much as I am enjoying presenting this one. Now, I'll start with a bit about myself. If you joined our Azure Spring Clean for the last couple of years, you might recognize me. I guess I'm a loyal returning speaker. I'm always excited when Thomas and Joe invite me again to do yet another delivery. So from my side, Peter the Tender, originally from Belgium, but living in the Redmond, Washington area, close to the Microsoft campus as my employer. Been working for Microsoft for 7 years, but then living in Redmond a bit more than 4 years. I joined initially as an Azure technical trainer in the West European team, and then managed to relocate to the US and continuing the role as a technical trainer because we did a little bit more than just focusing on Azure. But I recently moved to a different role where now I'm a senior content developer in the developing AI DevOps domain, and my core focus is everything DevOps. Now what that means is if you go to learn.microsoft.com, use any of the DevOps related titles, or you go to our Microsoft Learning GitHub repo with all the exercises and the labs, or you're participating in a training from one of our learning partners, then you're basically using my DevOps content. I also got my contact details here, so never hesitate to reach out in case of any questions where you think Peter is able to help you. Before jumping into the technicalities of the session, I want to start with a few assumptions. So first of all, this session is targeting anyone like yourself who first of all knows Azure DevOps. Next to that, maybe best case, you already know how to use Azure DevOps Boards, like the project management part of the platform. And then within, I assume you also need to know how to manage your work items. Think of epics, user stories, bugs, all that fun stuff. You need to know a bit about generative AI, also known as prompt engineering, up to a certain extent. And then most important, you must hate managing all of the above in a manual way, because that's really what we're going to try and talk about, how to smoothen that operation. So with that, immediately exposing the secret of all this, the magic is Azure Boards, which stores all that Agile, Scrum, basic, customized work item information. Where then from there, you're gonna add GitHub Marketplace into the story. Where you go to the GitHub Marketplace, you're gonna install the app for Azure Boards. And now you might go like, wait a minute, Peter, what's new about this? Because that integration, that GitHub app that allowed you to bring those two platforms together has been around for a couple of years. So that's where now the magic little piece comes in, and that's our little GitHub Copilot friend. Where now it's not just about establishing that boards integration with GitHub, but thanks to that integration, together with obviously GitHub repos and GitHub Copilot, you get that generative AI full interactive approach to integrate your Azure Boards information into a GitHub Copilot driven scenario. Sounds easy enough, right? Now, just to have it right, let me emphasize a couple of technical prerequisites that you need to put in place before all this is working. Pretty obvious, you need access to an Azure DevOps organization and a project. There's different permission levels, but even read permissions, depending a bit what you want to do with them, would be okay. I assume you got more than just read permissions. And then next to that, no surprise, you need some data to work with. Again, think of anything that lives in Azure Boards, bugs, epics, user stories, anything that you already manage today using Azure Boards. Next to that, you need a GitHub subscription, you need GitHub repo, and then again, you need GitHub Copilot. Now, also important for GitHub Copilot, although there is a free edition available, you need a paid version. Can be Pro, can be Enterprise, as long as you have the paid version, because you're using the premium capabilities. That's most important. Once you have all that up and ready, you're basically good to go. Oh wait, I'm gonna just show you in this next demo. In short, I'm gonna walk you through Azure Boards integration, how to get that up and running on the Azure DevOps side, how to get it working on the GitHub side using the Azure Boards Marketplace app, and then how to unlock GitHub Copilot. And I'm gonna show you VS Code integration where you can have that prompt going back and forth. So let's jump to the demo and from there, continuing the presentation. So the starting point for my demo is obviously my Azure DevOps environment. So I'm in my environment, my organization called PDT Demo Planet, and within I'm inside a project called MCP Demo 3, and then underneath I'm inside the boards. I got a whole bunch of items just like any other moving, live, running board scenario where I have some bugs, I got some features, got some epics, got some user stories, and some of these are assigned, some of them are active, resolved, and again, typically some sample information. I could also move to sprints and then getting a better view on like what's the work I'm like supposed to work on or what my team is working on. And then I also got the backlog. Now, if as a project manager or even myself as a DevOps engineer, I want to get a clear view on what is the stuff that I need to work on. As you could see here in just like a minute, it's moving up and down, left and right, and going through all those screens, all those portal blades, and then finding, or sometimes not even finding, the information you're looking for. That's exactly what we want to change with generative AI. So what we need to do here is connecting our DevOps environment with GitHub. There's a couple of different ways to do this. The first one I'll show you is out of the project, navigate to project settings and select GitHub connections. I already have it established because that speeds up the demo a little bit, but if it's the first time, and remember this is per project, right? You're gonna add a new connection, connect to GitHub, identifying which organization you want to use, and then from there, pick the account, where now obviously from here, I cannot move on. It's gonna tell me, oh, too bad, Peter, you already have one. But in reality, if you continue from here, it's gonna ask you for your GitHub credentials, pretty obviously, and then also identifying a GitHub repo, which doesn't need to hold any data. It's just the placeholder for the GitHub functionalities. Another way to do this is by installing that Azure Boards application on the GitHub side. So again, I'm in my GitHub account now. I go into my account, go to settings, go to apps or applications, and as you can see, Azure Boards is already enabled. If you did not install this yet on the personal account or maybe in your enterprise, you would go to GitHub Marketplace, like marketplace.github.com, and then searching for Azure Boards. From here, you're gonna configure it, and we need to authenticate. And then it's gonna provide you some explanation, what obviously the Azure Boards app is doing, and then what kind of scenario you want to use towards the repos. Now, just for my demos here, I'm using a test repo, and again, there's no real code in it for now, but it could point to, for example, Azure DevOps on one end with the boards project management piece, where then the actual source control repo is coming from GitHub and the pipelines are still running in DevOps. So pretty cool, nice integration there. So if you enable it from the GitHub application side, in the backend, it's also creating that DevOps connector. So the downside, I would say, is a bit that if you enable the connection on the Azure DevOps side, it's not automatically recognizing it for the boards. So I personally like to start from the Azure Boards in GitHub Marketplace app because I know it's creating that connection in the backend. But then from here, we can connect to for example, our GitHub Copilot. And I can run a prompt. I'm just going to copy it from the site. Like I have a few different work items in my sprint, and which of these are good candidates for GitHub Copilot coding agent. Like imagine these are a couple of bugs and 2 tasks where typically it involves some development work. That's what I'm asking for. So I'm going to kick this off, and thanks to that integration, it already knows which project to look into and reading out information. So it's pulling up some data from, let me go back to my boards inside my sprint. So now it's literally looking at this information, like some card updates. There's probably some features, some tasks, some bugs and whatnot. So that's now the information it uses, like, oh, there's a bug, product images are not showing up correctly. There's some out of stock items where the search is maybe a little bit off, and then some other tasks. So just looking at all the data in your work items, any type of work item, where now we can take it a step further and asking a little bit more about one specific bug, where I'm going to focus on the search results showing out of stock items. While it's running, I'll show you it's this one here, search results showing out of stock items. And in DevOps, I can open it up, but again, I'm already super familiar. I think I used Azure DevOps for the last 12 years, even before with TFS. So I sort of know where to go to. Now you can see here, there is this little integration already running. And from here, we could allocate some other tasks. Back to my view here, where now it's coming back like, well, this is some of the information. There's a summary, some other information. Not going to bore you with all the details, just some sample prompts, and then providing some acceptance information, sorting, and so on and so on. So now I could take it even further, where I'm going to grab some of this information. I go back to my DevOps environment, and I'm going to add this into my discussion. So what I'm doing here, and again, this is just copy pasting from a notepad. I'm defining a problem where the problem is search results include products, but some of them are not correct. Then what are some of the acceptance criteria? Like the out of stock products should display the visual. Out of stock items should appear at the bottom of the search. The filter options should hide out of stock items, and then some unit testing. And then I also have technical context and some testing. Now this is just text. So if you go like, well, we used to have a better way of organizing this and structuring this in our layouts, then obviously you can still do that. You're gonna save it, and it's just part of your discussion. So what we can do from here is then handing over this item to Copilot and creating a pull request. We link it to our GitHub repo that we used for the connection between the 2 platforms. And if you want, you can actually use different branches to start interacting, because now what the coding agent piece is doing is not only looking at the work items like I showed you initially, to replace your find and search for work item information. But we can now take it to the next step, where if there is a certain task, like in this example, updating, rewriting some code because the results are wrong, it's a bug, right? We're going to hand it over to Copilot. Then Copilot is going to look in source code and it's going to come up with code suggestions. So I delegate this to our Copilot friend. And then once we switch back, you can see here that I need to refresh, but you can see that I was playing with this a bit 36 minutes ago and then doing another, where now it's creating a deep link. I move to that link. It's opening up my repo. It created a new branch for the out of stock. And then it also creates a pull request. Inside the pull request, It's now looking at my work item, so that link is already there, and then it starts looping through different tasks. Now this typically takes a little bit of time, but you can see that the full detail from my Azure Boards discussion is now showing up here. The previous conversations that we had earlier, the link is going back to my ADO environment, like everything's there. From here it starts creating the plan, and then it's still working on it. So now I can move and open up the actual Copilot working session. You can see here that it is nicely running, and it's going to show you all the details. It's relying on Playwright Server, the Microsoft framework, for like unit testing if you want, but it can actually do a lot more. It's using the repo, it's now scanning the files, and as you can see here, it's looping through files, doing git commits, and anything that you as a developer or DevOps engineer would go through. I'm gonna skip this to my previous run and showing you the outcome. So we had all the tasks done, we get a nice report, we get a summary, and since it's a pull request, it means that we can actually do reviewing on our end. Copilot was our initial reviewer, and then from here we still have what we call human in the loop, and that means that some human being, maybe senior DevOps lead like a Scrum lead or someone who has that experience but also maybe the authority, can now go through the pull request, reading through all the information and even checking the different commits that happened out of Copilot. And then obviously, as you can expect, it also did a full rewrite of my application code that I already had in my repo, and I can inspect it, I can comment, it goes back, and we're basically closing the whole loop. I think with that, I showed you pretty good what that integration stands for, not only allowing you to interact with prompts, but also handing over information from Azure Boards into GitHub, calling GitHub Copilot coding agent to start reviewing code, updating code, using pull requests. Like the DevOps process is not changing. We're just adding some generative AI, GitHub Copilot powers into it. Let's switch back to the presentation and wrapping up the session. That's it. That's all, folks. Thanks for joining. I hope you enjoyed. Oh, wait. Because we're not done yet. There is a little bit more to talk about. What I'm talking about is why would you limit yourself to Azure Boards work items? Because there's a lot more than just work items in Azure DevOps. The magic here now is extending with Azure DevOps MCP server, which, as you can figure out, relies on the standard MCP protocol. If you already have Azure DevOps, it's probably already enabled for your Azure DevOps environment, assuming that you're running the cloud version of it. But even if you run Azure DevOps Server on-prem, you could actually make it MCP enabled. What that means is that work items out of the previous part was basically just a start on how to integrate generative AI into your Azure DevOps. Because now with MCP Server, you can interact with everything that you have in your Azure DevOps environment. But before all that, let's take a few steps back in. What is MCP? MCP, I guess it's the buzzword of the year, right? MCP, or Model Context Protocol, initially developed by Anthropic, the AI company, right, standardized how applications provide context to large language models. Now, if you think about large language models, they typically get the knowledge from scraping the public internet, which is kind of great, but it's also always behind in scope. So to fix that, you could architect what we call in AI terms a RAG architecture, retrievable augmented generation, which means you bring your own knowledge into the solution. The downside with that is that every AI platform or even generative AI solution was and still is handling that RAG architecture in a slightly different way, which means there's not a lot of cross-AI solution compatibility, and that's exactly what MCP Server is fixing now. Now, some also describe MCP as that USB-C for generative AI. I personally sometimes explain MCP as the REST API for generative AI solutions. So if you know a little bit about REST API calls, you need a client and you need a server. And then they are continuously communicating with each other. So like, for example, a retail web application connecting to a product database using REST APIs in between for that connectivity. Now, MCP basically works in the same way. The MCP client invokes tools. Think of functionalities, features, functions within the client connecting to the server, and then the server gives some response back to the client, and you as the user, you're gonna interact with it using natural language prompts. So the MCP server is like the listener, and a client can be pretty much anything: VS Code, Copilot Studio, and so many other scenarios. And that's what I'm trying to show here in maybe not even a complete, far from being a complete scenario, but to give you at least some examples. I try to squeeze some of this, like mostly my day-to-day MCP client and server environment, in one single slide. But know that it's really, really simplified. What that means is that there's probably more than 300 MCP server scenarios already available today. On the client side, typical scenarios include a development environment, VS Code, Visual Studio, Cloud Code if you're using it, GitHub, Docker, so many scenarios where you can trigger prompts to start interacting with the server side. And then obviously on the server side, there's so many different scenarios. You have developing oriented scenarios, but also traditional business applications. Because now really almost any of your traditional familiar business applications probably become available using that MCP protocol. Some examples: Azure itself. You know that you can interact with Azure using command line, using REST APIs, and now you can have a chat conversation with your Azure backend. Same for Azure DevOps, no secrets, I already teased it a little bit. But then also think about Microsoft Learn, our learning material platform. Instead of you going to the site searching for articles, modules, labs, and everything, you can now interact with it, but it can also bring in that up-to-date knowledge from our Learn platform into your development environment. And then away from the developing scope, if you have SAP as a backend, if you use Microsoft Dynamics, if you do Power BI, if you do other DevOps scenarios with like Jira, Atlassian Solutions, and so many more, you can integrate your business data using that MCP protocol. And you could guess, as I promised in the description, I like talking about it, but really trying to keep it to the bare minimum on slides, because I want to highlight what Azure DevOps MCP server looks like, how to enable it, how to interact with it, and then showing you some of its capabilities in this next demo. So for this next piece, I'm going to show you in my VS Code how to enable the Azure DevOps MCP server. Then from there, interacting using GitHub Copilot chat in my VS Code environment to interact with my Azure DevOps backend. So the starting point is obviously bringing in your Azure DevOps MCP server into your VS Code or any other development environment. There's a couple of different ways to do this. One of the easiest ones for now is just going to, I'll bring it in here, navigate to GitHub, Microsoft, and then Azure DevOps MCP. That's really the starting point where you can do the install from here. So you just click the button and it's going to install it. And then obviously there's a whole bunch of documentation on the site as well. Another option is using VS Code extensions, just like any other extension, where you can type in add MCP and that's bringing in a filter for all current MCP solutions being compatible with VS Code. So in here, you can search for like Azure DevOps, and then you're going to install it again, just like any other. Once you install it, you can look into your command palette. You can do MCP list servers, and it's going to show you the different servers. Now, depending a bit on the setup, some of these are always running as long as you like call them out. Some of these are running towards your backend servers. Some of them rely on local running Docker container. So if I navigate to my Azure DevOps MCP, I can open up the configuration. And what this now is doing is opening a file called MCP.json, which can be part of your user profile. That's the default VS Code behavior. But you could also create specific MCP.json settings file within your actual repo as part of the .github folder inside the repo. Now from here, and that's where I'm not going to bore you with all the details, all the possible settings. That's what you find in the documentation. But in short, what you have here is the Azure DevOps MCP. So that's just the name of the MCP server. And then the type is stdio, and that means it's running from a local perspective. There's another option where it's like a HTTP connection, where an example, the Microsoft Learn content is also available through MCP, and that would use HTTP as a connection. Next, you define some parameters, like it is Azure DevOps using the latest version, and then my ADO org is the name of my ADO organization. That's pretty much it. By the way, from here, as you can see, it also relies on, for example, a GitHub token, or it's going to ask me to authenticate. So there's a couple of different parameters you can still configure. Once all this is done, we can start interacting using our chat conversation. So I could, for example, run an easy prompt. I'm just going to copy it from my little notepad. List all projects in my DevOps organization. Since I already have my organization name in the MCP settings, it already knows. And then from there, it's going to authenticate using my Azure DevOps credentials. And that's what it uses to connect to the backend. So as you can see here now, it's starting to gather information, and I still need to confirm. Now you can define a couple of settings here for any other actions that your Copilot chat will perform. So you could allow it once, that's a default. I could allow similar sessions into this workspace, or I could go like, I know what I'm doing, I trust Copilot, and I don't want to or need to confirm all of this every single time. What it also does is running here what we call a tool. So what is that tool? If you think back about that piece in the presentation, a tool is a set of configuration functions, options if you want, that your Copilot environment can use. So if I go into my toolbox, these are all the tools that I have available. Now one of them is a toolbox here called ADO. And as you can see, I got a whole bunch of other ones. Oops. And then inside ADO, I'll make it a little bit bigger. This is the list of actions, function calls that the MCP server provides. So getting alerts, listing projects, getting build changes, listing up runs, pipelines, create pull requests. So it's not only reading information, but it's also performing tasks, create something, update something, and do Azure DevOps tasks for me, all driven using chat conversation. So I'm going to allow this session, and that's going to list up all the projects that I have. Now to show you here on the side, it's asking me to authenticate. Now you can use a token, personal access token, but I'm not a huge fan of those at least not for more interactive tasks like this one. So what you see here, since we started with list all projects, natural language based, that gets translated into a tool, core list projects, and now it's listing up the projects. So I'm going to go for project 4, where now I'm like, well, can I sort of tell the agent to always look at version or project 4 in this context? Definitely you can do that. I will use project MCP demo 4. Can you memorize this so that all remaining interactions are against this project? So what it does here is telling you, like, I'm going to store this in my session, and to do that, I'm going to create a little memory file. Now this file, if you hover over it, it's stored in your VS Code user profile settings, workspace, and it's just a folder. So every chat conversation can now be extended, if you want, with some memory settings. If I now open up the file, you can see that it has some instruction, description, default Azure DevOps project, MCP demo 4, and then apply this project, which now means that instead of me going back and forth and adding all those prompts, I could now define my prompts into this markdown file. If you already did a little bit with what we call AgentMD, providing agent descriptive approach to building agents or using them, together with skills, instructions, and prompts, this is using the exact same approach. So now we know the project, and let's start with, can you show me the list of work items I need to work on in the current sprint? So it's going to analyze the natural language approach to my prompt, and then it's going to try and map it with existing tools. So it's again asking for a confirmation where it's listing up the tool called work list iterations. It already knows the project, and it's using like depth 3, which means it's looking at the epic, the user stories, to make sure that I got all the information I'm looking for. So we're currently in sprint number 3. And then next I'm querying the work items. And then from here, it's just asking a confirmation, repeat to enable specific domains like work items, core, search, and so on. I'm just gonna confirm. And from here, it's gonna loop through and finding more information. Since I'm working with boards and I'm reading like get work items, I trust it. So I'm going to try and avoid a couple of prompts where now I'm just flagging like it's okay, it's safe, and don't ask me that continuous confirmation anymore. The nice thing here is that it literally exposes all the different tasks that it goes through. And then as you can see, sometimes it's failing, but the nice thing with generative AI is that it actually also tries to fix itself. So it's now looking back and then trying to come up, running. And as you can see here behind the scenes, it's relying on Azure DevOps CLI. I remember a couple of years ago when we got Azure DevOps CLI for the first time. I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. I can now interact with Azure DevOps using command line, where now the next wave, you could say, is interacting with it using prompts. You can see that every now and then it's challenged a little bit in knowing how to run that query, but then eventually it will go through. Now, if you go like, well, I don't want to wait for it, and let's move to the next task, you can see down here that it is running, where you used to stop this, stopping the current session, where now you can just continue the conversation, what we call steering. So what we can do is create a new bug. And with these details. And then I'm going to make it a little bit easy for myself and then just copy pasting. So I want a new bug with a specific title, something run on Safari mobile with iOS, and then it gets a certain priority and a severity for the criticality of the problem. So now up here, you could see that eventually it was working on it, but since I was like, yeah, forget about it, I'm moving on to the next task, it automatically canceled. And now it comes back with the tool called create work item. It captures this in a JSON layout. I'm going to confirm, and that should end up in an actual work item. Where now, if I switch to my work item view, it's still working on it. There we go. ID 594, which just got created. Login page on mobile Safari. It's in a new state. It's linked to priority 2, severity 2, and there is no iteration because I didn't specify it right. So that's one example how you can easily make changes. Now this is creating a new one, but what we can do is now, for example, can you allocate work item 594 to sprint 3? And then obviously, can you assign it to Peter, and so on and so on. Again, while this is running, I don't want to wait for it. You probably get the idea that it is working. I can now do show me the latest pull requests. Because now maybe I'm shifting my day tasks a little bit, and I'm going to look into source control, going to look into pull requests, and then from there, again, getting feedback. I could make my prompts a little bit more complete, where you could ask for show me PRs targeting the main branch or any other branch, list up the PRs older than a week, and it will pull up all that information. So now it came back with a response. There's pull request number 9. Add authentication. There is a feature. It got created a couple of days ago, and this is the link, which means if I copy this over, it would immediately send me to my DevOps, where now I can move to my repo, move to my pull requests, and it's not refreshing because it's in a different repo. There we go. Add authentication feature, documentation. Everything's there. I can look into the files which got updated, and we're still doing DevOps. I can now add comments. So imagine back in my chat conversation, I'm going to paste in another prompt, add a comment to PR number 9. The PR says now reviewed and closing, and it's okay to complete the merge. From here, refresh my pull requests, and takes a little bit longer, but you can see that it's now flagged to be completed. All that information comes in just by running, some prompts. I sometimes forget that I need to confirm. There we go, this is better. So PR reviewed and closing, okay to complete the merge. Now from here, it's not really taking an action. Now, if you want, you could actually do that. That's just the wording in the scenario. Next example, so we move from boards into source control, where now you can guess, I'm going to show you what it takes to trigger a pipeline. List up all my build pipelines. Because I don't want to look for the name. Maybe I don't remember because I got a couple of hundreds of them. And why would I search for it if I can just ask for it? And again, I'm showing you all the details where now it tells me, hey, you seem to have 2 pipelines. Let's validate. I go into my pipelines, all of them. I got a CI pipeline and a CD pipeline. And then I could go like, okay, to trigger the CI one. Similar to telling your colleague, okay, push the button, click here, do this, do that. You would now trigger the pipeline. And then once the pipeline is running, show me the latest status of pipeline 35, where initially it showed queued, and then maybe if it's fast enough in running, you're going to see that it's then moving over to complete failed state. It's failed for obvious reasons because it's not about the pipeline. I didn't really configure anything with it, so it tries to run a task, but there is basically no task to run, and that's where it's failing, but that's not really too important for my demo. Other example is, obviously, if you don't expose all those details, you might not even see that it's using like Azure DevOps CLI. But what I liked about this is why not using this as a learning tool? Because now, at the same time that you're doing Azure DevOps interaction tasks using, again, natural language, you could now, on top of this, also learn a little bit more about Azure DevOps CLI, which might or might not be a good use case anymore. I think I'm getting a bit rusty on my CLI skills because I'm relying on prompts for pretty much anything I'm doing nowadays. With that, I'm gonna return to the presentation, wrapping it up from here. But in short, what I showed you is how to set up the MCP server in VS Code, how to get it installed, validating the tools, and then obviously using them in a couple of easy, straightforward syntax, natural language-based approach, asking information about work items, creating new work items, asking status about repos, commits, pull requests, and then interacting with pipelines. Let's go back to the presentation. Good. Wow, that worked. Now, if you think this was cool, which first of all, I really hope you do, but then also maybe you need a little bit more time because what we're talking about here is brand new technology. MCP is new, Azure DevOps, hopefully not that new for most of you, but still crazy cool platform with a lot of capabilities. And maybe you need a little bit more time to digest all that information to maybe go back to the demos. Well, then I got some good news. What's the good news? All of this is published on our Learn platform. I recently published 2 Learn modules exactly covering what I talked about in this session. So if you go to that URL, learn.microsoft.com/training/modules, and then you add manage ADO boards using GitHub Copilot or manage ADO MCP server, it's going to send you to our Learn modules. Takes about an hour to read through all the content. And if you want, there's also a link to the more hands-on approach, the practice labs, as we call it, where again, just keep in mind, you need your Azure subscription with Azure DevOps, although there's a PowerShell script in the repo of the exercise to actually enable all of that for you with sample data that you can reuse. And then from there, remember, you also need that GitHub Copilot subscription in the paid version to go through all of this. With that, I'm gonna close out. So this is, again, thanks, that's all folks, but for real now, thanks for now. Enjoy the rest of the Azure Spring Clean week. Oh, by the way, one last thing. If you want to learn even more about agentic DevOps, then I would say come back tomorrow for another session I'm doing together with Nicholas Chang, where we're gonna talk about doing even more cool things with agentic AI in a DevOps context. Hoping to see you there. Enjoy the rest. Thank you so much.